Welcome, everyone. As everybody begins to see, this is probably a great time for me to remind you to turn your cell phone to mute. But please feel free to take photos and tweet it out and put it on Instagram. My name is Alice Knapp. I'm the CEO of the Ferguson Library, and this is our Civility in America lecture series. We do this with the Dylan Schneider Group and Hearst Media, and I'm just very excited that A, we're in person, and we have been really since January, but B, the lineup this spring has been incredible. And just a sneak preview, in May, it's going to be Joanne Lublin. She's a former correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. We have on June 2nd, it's going to be former Secretary of State John Bolton. Yeah, and then I forget when Vincent Fay is, but he's going to end up the season and lead us into a great summer of baseball. But tonight we're here, and I could just feel the excitement in the room as everybody was hugging Christopher Shays. Christopher Shays represented the Southwest region of Connecticut from 1987 to 2009 in the United States Congress. A moderate Republican who's socially progressive and fiscally conservative, Shays had a strong record of reaching across the aisle to address our nation's problems. The only Republican congressman from New England elected in 2006. Shays was consistently recognized for his bipartisan leadership. And during his 21 years in Congress, Shays rose to become a senior member of the Budget, Financial Services, Homeland Security, and Government Reform Committees. Shays and his wife, Betsy, are former Peace Corps volunteers in Fuji and that championed the National Service Program, helping to create AmeriCorps. Shays is a graduate of Principia College, NYU Stern School of Business, and the Wagner School of Public Administration. And the last thing I'll say before I hand it over to him, when we get to Q&A, it's important that you use the mic because we do have people on Zoom tonight. So with that.
Thank you, Alice. So, you guys almost bring me to tears. When I was in third grade, I thought I wanted to work in government. My teacher, I must have been hyperactive, but she gave me all these books about American heroes. And I knew at a very young age, and by the time I was a senior in high school, I thought maybe I would run for public office. And in college, I decided to. And in 1974, I got to run for the State House of Representatives in Stamford. I had the best teachers. I was going to name some names, but there are too many here. And if I left a name out, I'm not going to name anyone. But what I want you to know is I was taught the right way. I was taught to work with both sides of the aisle. I was taught to put my state first, my town first, my country first. You all in Stamford taught me that. It was the best school anyone could ever have gone through. So knowing I was going to come here tonight, I thought the first thing I want to say is thank you. Thank you for allowing me to live a dream, and thank you for allowing me to live a dream the right way. So I have my wife, Betsy, and my daughter, Jeremy, here. And Jeremy is instructed, not that I had to instruct her. And when I say 15 minutes, she's going to hit the clock, and in the middle of whatever sentence I'm in, I'm stopping, and we're going to take questions and answers. But before my 15 minutes, I just want to tell you a little about what I intend to do, and that is focus on what it's like to be in public life. And I want you to know that it's a 24/7 job. I want you to know that members of Congress or state reps, we know a little about everything because we have to. And then we focus on just a very few things and hopefully know a lot about it. I'm not sure if that's still true today, but that's the reality. And I can tell you it can be very intimidating because at every community meeting I went to, I knew that everyone there knew something more about something than I did. And I mean even a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old. What is it like to be in school and be intimidated? What's it like to grow up with technology? Think of the things they know that I don't know. I can say I used to be young, but at any rate. And the thing that I loved about the job is I learned something new every day, and I got to meet the most unbelievable people that I would never have had the opportunity to meet otherwise. So I cheated a little bit because that wasn't part of my 15 minutes. Jeremy, hit the clock. So in the next 15 minutes, I want to share with you what I think the job requires to be an effective elected leader. It requires listening, learning, helping, teaching, and then leading. So it's listen, learn, help, teach, and lead. And then you go right back to listening again. And I'm going to illustrate it by two stories that are heart-wrenching for me. I could give you so many stories, but one is about the rape and murder of Sandy Hoyt, who lived in Stanford. And the other is about the loss of nearly 3,000 people in 9/11. I was a state rep when Sandy Hoyt lost her life. I was a congressman in 9/11. So Sandy, at age 14, was called to see if she would be a babysitter for a doctor. And she had a little bit of reservations about it. And she met the doctor at Hoyt Street. He was strolling a child. He wasn't a doctor. And Dad had second thoughts. And he went by and she waved him away. That's the last time he ever saw Sandy Hoyt. Bruce Williams was arrested. He learned that from the newspaper. Her body was found. He learned that from someone else other than the authorities that should have told him. He was given no rights to address the court, and he was given no right to get any information. Now, what happened was, I'm living in North Stanford and I'm reading the Stanford Advocate, and he's crying out for someone to listen to him and the horror that he is going through. And so that's the first part. I contacted him, and this isn't about me. This is about anyone who's doing their job. So I called him up and we sat down and talked, and he walked me through all the indignities he had to deal with and the horror he had to live with, knowing that he had reservations and he didn't act on them. So I started to learn things, didn't I? I learned he had no rights. I learned that he was being treated in a very incredibly insensitive way. I learned he had no right to address the court. I learned he had no one to turn to. So we started working on that. And one of the things we did was we said victims should have a victim's advocate. So we established a victim's advocate. We then kind of interacted with the court to say, come on, you know, let this person have the ability, a right to come and testify at the trial. We learned that he was given 20 years to life. Well, I was impressed, life. No, they take it on the 20 years and then they give you good time. For every 3 years, you get one good time off. So he could be eligible to be out after 14 years. Those are the things we learned. What did we do? We met with the prosecutors and they said, you know, if you could make it 40 years, I won't even have to take some of these people to trial, because I can say 40 years. No, you're going to be in jail for 30 years and you're not going to be able to get out with such early good time. So we changed that whole process. I also learned that there were no real attorneys on the Judiciary Committee. So I asked to be on it. The attorneys who practiced law were the ones there, and they weren't not people who were on the prosecuted side of the agenda. So they were not as sensitive to what it might be like. So at any rate, we changed it. We listened, we learned, we helped him, and we ended up leading, because part of my job was to educate all my fellow members who didn't know any more than I knew before I started. And that's how the law started to change. By the way, when I got in the Judiciary Committee, I learned that lawyers had a special way to protect them from grievance. And that's a whole nother story, because we changed the grievance process and I ended up in jail for 7 days in the process of trying to change that. Now, 9/11. I'm in my building like you. I walk in, I learn that some blind pilot ran into one of the towers. And then we learned it wasn't a blind pilot, it was intentional. And then we saw what happened with the second one. I stayed in my office because I figured my staff, and I told my staff they could leave, but I figured that I was going to have people calling me. I thought, let's see, both Twin Towers, and when they fell, I fell to my knees. I could not believe it. I literally fell to my knees. And I thought, how many of my constituents, how many people are going to die, but how many of my constituents? Well, it turned out there were 72, is that right, Mary? 72 constituents. So when you saw a car at a railroad station for a few days, it was probably one of the 72. They didn't get to come back and drive their car home. And I'm going to tell you 4 families and 4 services we went to. The first was Joe Coppa. He was a man very involved in New Canaan. The service was in that very large Catholic church in the semi-round. And Joe III, Joe Jr. was the one killed. Joe III, his son, addressed everyone and said, Dad, and speaking of his dad, you wanted me to be a man. You wanted me to learn this, 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 and this. And you wanted me to do this. You spent all your time making me hopefully become a man. And he said, Dad, I'm a man. And I'm going to be there to take care of my mom, who's Pat, and my siblings. I'll be there for them because you taught me. And he ended up calling our office and saying, I want my life to be of service. He ended up being an intern in our office. He ended up being a Marine. And his life is in total service to our country based on that commitment he made when his dad was killed in 9/11. I'm going to just tell you the interaction. How much time do I have left, sweetheart? How many? I think I can do it. The next one is Brad Fetchett, a young man who died. His father and his mom are right here. And his father, Frank, addressed the same church, and both times they were packed, standing crowd only. And Frank, I'll never forget what you said. You said, son, I wanted you to learn so many things, but son, I learned far more from you than I ever taught you. I'll never forget it. And it was meant, and it was heart true. And I'm going to talk about Mary just briefly when we talk about what we did. And then the third family was 3 people lost their life: Peter Hansen, Sue Ken Hansen, and Christine, who was 3 years old. They were flying from Boston down to, I forgot what, California. And their mom and dad actually was speaking to them on the phone, watching the TV as the plane crashed into the tower. The service was in Easton in a small church, and we were outside, and they talked about the son. They talked about the wife, who wasn't as well known. She was a Korean woman and didn't have as many people who knew her. And then I said, what about Christine? What about Christine? And all of a sudden, 11 teachers came up from her school in Boston and talked about all the qualities of this precious 3-year-old child, and then asked us to hold hands and sing the Barney song. Now, Betsy and I were about to leave because we didn't want to be the presence. We didn't want people to think, oh, we were there, to be noticed. But they said, the family wants to speak to you. And Lee Hansen said to me, Chris, Mr. Shays, this can't be about anger and hate. Now, the last family, because I want to tell you what we did, so let me move on. Brothers Keith and Scott Coleman lost their lives. They worked at Cantor Fitzgerald, where they lost over 658. And the service was in Westport, and their third son, Todd, talked about his 2 brothers, Keith and Scott, and talked about how they had so much fun together. And now he said, I don't have my brothers anymore. And it was part of who he was. So again, we wanted to kind of leave and not be the presence. And they said the family wants to, the mom and dad want to speak to you. And if it wasn't exactly the same, it amounted to the same. They said, Mr. Shays, this can't be about anger and hate. Think of what I'm experiencing. Think of what my wife's experiencing. Think of my staff. They went to all these services. So what did that do? Mary calls me up and says, I want you to meet with 4 women. I'd been in touch with her and she said, I want you to meet with 4 women. They all lost their husbands. And they all said to me, Mr. Shays, if my husband lost his life, his buddies would be there to help me. But all 4 of these women said, we lost our husbands and we lost our husbands' buddies. There was no one for them. So what did this lead to? It led to someone like Mary. I had a staff member, and I always told my staff they worked for you all, not me. And I had a staff member that printed a book that showed all the services that people could get, those 4 women who had no one to turn to, and things that go the gamut of what happens when you lose a loved one and what you do with the government. It also was we printed 600 of these because people around the country wanted them. My staff member who put this together was so involved in this that she ultimately left my office because she just wanted to be more helpful. She was my district director. Excuse me, she was my district director. And I said, you know, you still are the district director. You got to deal some with other. She wanted totally to focus on that. So what did Mary and so many other families deal with? They demanded that we have a commission on 9/11. And with Carolyn Maloney, she and I were kind of the chief sponsors of that. They then demanded that the recommendations be passed. And what were they? That was the Homeland Security and having a national director. Remember, we had 19 different intelligence groups. And we wanted, and they all had information. And if they all had come together, we would have probably been aware of preventing this. We ended up having he came twice, Ken Feinberg. And one of the things we wanted to try to do was we wanted to not have lawsuits go on for 50 years. So the government set up a fund of $7 billion. And his job was to try to figure out how there should be compensation. And my point to you was, we wanted the families to get as much help as they could. So it was involving a listening, meeting with those 4 families, meeting with Mary and Frank. It involved listening, learning. It involved helping. It involved teaching my colleagues, and they taught me. And I was being taught. It's not my just teaching, it's my being taught. And then it was, you know, you got to lead. Am I under my 15 minutes? Under 2 minutes. So what I want to do, I want to throw it open to questions, comments. Someone said, well, I don't want to embarrass you and ask a hard question. I don't care. I mean, I care that you ask the question you want to ask. And I'd love to have some dialogue about whatever you want to have dialogue about. Yes. So we got to wait for the mic.
Got to wait for the mic. And we do have 24 people on a Zoom, so we'll probably ask some questions from them as well.
I will try to be here for Zoom people, so whatever. Does the camera move?
Yeah.
Oh, it does move. I can take this? Okay.
You mentioned how a politician should be learning and reading and helping others and so forth. But you didn't mention how honest a politician should be.
Okay, you want to deal about the honesty? Okay. What we did in my office, dealing with honesty, well, first off, you have to have a wife like Betsy, and you have to have a daughter that you don't ever want to embarrass. And Betsy said to me one time, she said, if you get in trouble, I'm not going to be the dutiful wife as you apologize to the public and stand behind you. She said, you're on your own. We had a great way to have honesty and not to hopefully embarrass constituents. I mean, I've said things that have embarrassed me and I wish I hadn't said them. but we call it our community meeting test. If I couldn't justify it in a community meeting, I can't do it. And I'll give you one example. I was going to Iraq. I went 19 times. And I went there because I voted to go there. And then I found out it was not a good vote. And I, being a former Peace Corps volunteer, by the way, I stayed with Iraqi families the first 4 times I went. And I went when they didn't want me to go. I oversaw Defense and State Department in the subcommittee I was chairman of. So if Defense didn't want me to go, State would let me go, and vice versa. Now to answer your question. So I'm going to Iraq, and I noticed that there's the Paris Air Show. And I noticed my plane stopped in Paris. So I said to my long-term appointment person advisor, I'm going to go to the Paris Air Show. She said, what do you mean? I said, the plane stops there. I'll spend the night there. I'll go to the Paris Air Show, and none of my constituents will mind because I'm going to Iraq. And she said, I don't think that's a good idea. She left and slammed the door. In comes my chief of staff. She says, both women, by the way, boss, I understand you want to go to the Paris Air Show. Can we talk about you? Yeah, I was ready for this argument. And she said, may I ask you a few questions? I said, yeah. I mean, not quite like that, but that's how I felt. She said, you're not on the aviation subcommittee of transportation, right? I said, yeah. In fact, boss, you're not even on the transportation committee. And then she said, so what are you going to tell your constituents when someone complains about the fact you went to the Paris Air Show at their expense? And my response was, I guess I'm not going to the Paris Air Show. Honesty matters a whole lot. It helps if you have a family that helps you. It helps if you did things when you were young that were foolish. I took some coins from my brother when I was 6 years old, and I was caught. It was good I was caught. I wish Bill Clinton had been caught doing certain things when he's younger, and he wouldn't have done it when he was older. So it matters a whole bunch.
Hi. So you brought up 9/11, former military industrial complex employee. It was all rather embarrassing. I thought we had 17 intelligence agencies. You're telling me 19. Got the Air National Guard Strategic Air Command and the world's best Air Force. So who dropped the ball and in what order? Who took responsibility for not paying attention at all? There had been many hijackings abroad, Air France, et cetera, Tenerife. It was already a global problem, and it had been done before, and yet we're completely unprepared.
So this is what I think. I think that when we blow it, we need to admit we've made a mistake. And I think the public will appreciate us more than to try to pretend it doesn't happen. The challenge we have, first off, a congressman has any resource he or she wants to get at the story. But what has happened in recent years is if you go to the department head, they will tell you something in the room, and then you say, I want you to come and testify and share that. Their statement has to be approved by the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. And so anything that is said has to be approved. There was a member of Congress who didn't run again, and he was made the general of the Army Corps, and he wore a suit, and he was in charge of the Corps of Engineers. And he went to the budget director and said, you're not giving me enough money. And he said, this is the way the locks are supposed to work down in Louisiana, but the locks look like this. In other words, totally deformed. And he said, I need money to fix it. And the head of the Office of Budget and Management said, Mike, we don't have the money. Be a good soldier and stick with the statement. So at the hearing, he was asked, do you have the money necessary to take care of the flooding that potentially can happen in the South? And he honestly answered, no, I do not. That afternoon, he was fired. And that would have happened whether it was a Democrat or Republican. In this case, it was a Republican administration. And so my point to you is the struggle right now is to have the administration say, you know, we don't have what we need here. We need to get it. And I will tell you this, I'm not sure that President Bush even knew that. So people under him, if we had more honesty in our public hearings, I think the man at the top might know a little bit more about what, or woman eventually, about what's going on. So it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge, getting the truth and knowing about it. And again, and the people who should know mostly are the people in the committee. Remember, we know a little about everything, but in committee, that's where we should have the expertise. The challenge is it doesn't relate quite to corruption or dishonesty, but it relates to members of Congress are being forced to raise a lot more money. And they're spending Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, at least 3 hours a day, raising money for their campaigns.
We have a question from the
Sure.
chat. Do you think Republicans have a chance of winning statewide office in your former seat in the U.S. 4th Congressional District?
Well, first, let me say about my former seat. When I lost the election, it wasn't a happy day, but I at least knew I lost to someone who was competent. Not necessarily have my views and so on. So that's how I sorted that out. What was sad for me when I lost was that I was going to be chairman of the Government Reform Committee. I would have been able to hire, if I was in the minority, 40 staff, and if I was in the majority, 80. And I had worked for that opportunity. And I wouldn't have hired 80, I would have hired 60 and just paid them more and gotten really quality staff. And that's the committee that investigates anything and everything. And I would have made it bipartisan. And I would have gotten kind of at this very thing that was being addressed before. What about our mistakes and what do we do about it? Let me just quickly tell you that 25,000 people lost their life with tainted blood years ago from AIDS, 25,000. And they were hemophiliacs. And the administration, a Democratic administration, had not done the job of upgrading it. I was able to get the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I said, please talk before my subcommittee. We're not going to pass blame on you for not doing that. What we want to know is what do we need to do so it doesn't happen from that point on. And she came and testified and we made changes. Instead of it being, you come here and I'm going to blame you, and then nothing happens. I'm not sure I answered the question though that was asked. I got carried away.
The question was, do you think Republicans have a chance of winning
Yeah,
statewide
right.
office in your old seat?
No, I wasn't trying to stall that one. You know, they do. The question is, do they deserve to? And I'll leave that up to you. I am not a fan of President Trump, and I want to tell you why. No, and some of his issues I agreed with. I happen to think it's crazy what's happening in immigration. So there'll be some of you who think otherwise, but I think it's crazy what we're doing now, allowing so many people to come in. It's just crazy from my standpoint. There are some other things. I like the fact that Trump said, you members of Congress always say the capital should be in Jerusalem, but you never do it. And he did it. And so I felt that was a good thing to have done. It is a disgrace, in my judgment, almost criminal in this sense. When there's an inauguration, I would go at the end of the inauguration to the other side of the Capitol. And I was one of like 4 people that would watch. And they would walk down the carpet. Who? The former president and the new president. And the former president would be ushered into a helicopter with his family, and the helicopter would circle and leave. And you saw this wonderful transfer of power. The obligation of someone who loses is to salute the winner. And you may not have noticed, Betsy and I, we moved down to Washington. We thought Jim had his right to do his job. So that's the way I viewed it. So to me, the most serious thing that you could do is, as the person who loses the election, not accepting the verdict of the American people and claiming something that is so totally false. I can never forgive him for that, because I think it's destructive to our democratic process. Do we need some reforms? Yes. When I was in Bridgeport on the election day, when I lost, a woman came up to me and said, a funny thing happened to me, Chris, when I went to vote. I said, Ethel, what was that? She said, my ballot was already filled out. Remember how I told you how I collapsed to my knees with 9/11? I felt like that. I thought, my God. And I said, would you speak to the press? She said, no, they fixed it. I said, how did they fix it, Ethel? She said, they gave me a new ballot. Excuse me, but I said, what the F did, because that's how I felt, I'm being honest, what the F did they do with the old ballot? So I'm not claiming that everything is perfect, but when the votes are, that wide, if I had won, I would have wanted to look at it. When I lost, I thought, oh yeah, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna complain because there was some problem there? No. Jim didn't deserve it, and the country didn't deserve it. So I want Republicans to remember who they were. They were fiscally conservative and hopefully socially concerned, applying conservative values to it. But I don't see it anymore. Yeah.
In The Advocate today, there's an article about a movement to try to remove flavored vaping products and advertising to young people. I can tell you it's kind of epidemic in Lower Fairfield County and among high school students. But the article went on to say that they don't think that it's going to pass because of lobbying. People who are supportive of the vaping industry. I have a difficult time understanding how lobbying could influence someone to make a decision if they don't think it's the right decision. So I still don't understand how lobbying is effective at making politicians vote a certain way on topics that, I mean, this should be a no-brainer, but according to the article, they didn't think it was going to be able to pass.
We bring to the office some of our own biases. And my bias is what our children are exposed to is pretty outrageous. And that goes to the games, the violence in games, the violence in some movies and so on, but the violence in games. And I think it's been very destructive for the mentality of our society. So my tendency would be to be supportive of some sensible regulations, and we have to define sensible regulations. That would be where my focus would be. But again, this is the other thing. We had the community meeting test on whether you're going to be in the straight and narrow. My other one was, Congressman Shays, why did you vote for that? Well, would the reason be that the lobbyists told me? I have to give them a sensible answer. And I always made an assumption that my constituents were pretty sensible and would know if I'm giving them bull and know if I didn't have it in my heart. So if I can't explain something logically and comfortably, then I'm not going to do it. If I can't explain it in a town hall meeting why I did something, I'm not doing it. If I can explain it in a town hall meeting, then I could do it. That was my test. It was a good test.
All right, we have another question from the chat. Given the partisanship and polarization that exists in Congress today, what would you do to promote more civility in the public discourse in the House and Senate?
Okay, first I want to say to you, term limits has helped cause that problem. You have logical term limits, don't vote for the person. But Henry Hyde, for instance, had been in office a long time. I would sit next to Henry on the floor and he would give me history of what happened many years ago. And then I could put some things in perspective. So the concept of partisanship, though, stems from this fact. When Republicans won in 1994, we had 10 things we wanted to do on opening day. The first thing, by the way, New called the Shays Act until the conservatives didn't like it. It was putting Congress under 40 years where Congress wasn't under. We weren't under OSHA. We weren't under sexual harassment. We weren't, and it put us all under that. And we did 10 things in the first 100 days. But the thing we did that has caused this directional mess, we started to target the conservative Democrats who thought the way we did. And we would contest those conservative Democrats who were in the middle. What did the Democrats do? They targeted the moderate Republicans. I have a number of Democrats say, Chris, I wish you were still here. Not that they wouldn't want Jim there, but I wish you're still here. And no, but they targeted me for 6 years. And that's fair. I mean, but what they did is, so if this were the liberal side of the equation, and picture a graph paper, and this in the bottom was, I said liberal, right? And this is the conservative side. And then there's a line that goes up of population. The population way up here, down here. And it would be, I think, leaning conservative, but still somewhat in the center. What you have in Congress is an inverted bell curve. There's no one in the middle. And if they're in the middle, they're afraid to admit it. So you have some really outrageous people on the left and some really outrageous people on the right. And they're determining what our public policy is. And it's the same problem when we choose our presidential candidates now. They have to place, I mean, it amazes me. I supported Joe Biden, but it amazes me how he's willing to have the far left dictate some of his policy. No, good for women, good that he's doing it for women and minorities. And someone said, boy, I thought maybe he would appoint me in the Peace Corps. We're saying that, right? But no, he's going to port a woman or an African-American or an African-American woman, and he should. But think of the other things he's doing. I don't understand for the life of me how he wants to deal with the border the way he's dealing with it, given all the other challenges we have. I just don't understand it. And by the way, when we got out of Afghanistan, and he said, all my advisors agreed with me, I thought, get new advisors. I would have my staff, I would always have someone on my staff who would disagree, but we learned from that disagreement and we moved one way or the other. I hope I'm answering the question and not answering what I want to answer. If I'm not answering your question, get back at me. Anybody else? Because I'll bring up some other things if we don't have questions.
I just have some comments. If it weren't for Chris Shays and Carolyn Maloney and Senator Lieberman and Susan Collins, there would never have been a commission. And the reason that that it worked is because they were able to work together. And you know, I think Chris sort of downplayed his role in that. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. It was years, a year to get the commission established, a year for the commission to do the report, a year, you know, I kept every
But let me give him the rest of the story. I had to deal with you.
That's right.
I had to deal with you. No, I mean, seriously, what do you say to someone who's lost their loved one, their son? What do I say to Beverly Eckert, who met her husband when they were in high school and spoke for him an hour on the phone while he's in the tower, saying goodbye to him? I mean, she had religion. And so the families were a huge motivator. And I could also use you and threaten my colleagues that I'll sick Mary on you if you don't cooperate.
No, I was very bipartisan, but I do think.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate your comments.
No, there were 12 of us
and
at
they were
the beginning, and I think 4 of us by the end. We got through the 3rd or 4th cycle, because every year I'd say, "Oh, it was nice meeting you." "Oh no, you have to come back because now it has to be legislated." Then it had to be funded. But I remember one thing that's seared in my mind is we had hit a roadblock. And it was late at night and the House was meeting, and Chris came in late into the meeting, and you know, the one group was on the right, one group was on the left, and Chris just stood in the middle. And it was just so symbolic. But his shoulders were slumped down because it was so exhausting. It was also exhausting. and what you had to say, you know, we have to
Notice I'm not interrupting her.
We have to do what's right. You know, we can't allow this to happen again.
Mary, thank you for saying
so
that.
I just appreciate all that you've done.
I always wanted to be good in your eyes. So I'm going to tell you a kind of funny story that happened to me, and I know we'll have other questions, but just these are the things that happen in your life. I'm newly elected, l'ambiance happened, 27 people killed as the floors collapsed as they were building in Bridgeport. Stuart McKinney had passed away, and Chris Dodd and I were working to get the OSHA to ban slab lifting. And anyway, I'm at a meeting, and I was new, and remember I came in a special, so I came all by myself in a special election, and I was told, you know, sometimes because you're going to get credit for things you don't deserve, and people are going to be really nice to you. And so I'm sitting in the front row while the union guys are talking about how wonderful I was, going on and on and on. And they went on, and it was almost embarrassing. I mean, I just didn't even know how I could get up and say anything. And they said, Chris, would you like to say something? And I stood up, and Chris Dodd behind me stood up. And they were talking about Chris Dodd, of course. So I learned early on that if they say, we have a wonderful speaker day, I'd like to invite him up, and so on. If they don't mention my names, I sit down until my name is mentioned. And that's to save me a number of embarrassing moments. Do we have some questions? Yes, I'm sorry.
Yes, hi, Chris. What's your reaction to the way we handled the COVID-19 crisis?
I felt that it was becoming politicized when it shouldn't have been. I felt that the scientists deserve to be listened to. And I felt that in past experiences, we had certain restrictions that ultimately were beneficial. So I felt that if people didn't want, for instance, to have the vaccine, then there's certain things they wouldn't be allowed to do, but that would be their permission, their decision. And if certain people had the vaccine, then they would be allowed the opportunity to do more. And I felt that that was being thoughtful to the other people who might be in the room. So, I mean, that's how I sorted it out. Now, you're not always right when you make these decisions, and you want to be sensitive about it and you want to understand. But I thought it was, well, let me back up. I have to give you this history, and now you'll know why I think this. I chaired the National Security Subcommittee of the Government Reform Committee. It had oversight of Defense and State Department. I went with Nunn and Lugar. The opportunities I had are mind-boggling. I went with Nunn and Lugar to Russia. We went to this was after the Cold War had ended early on. We went to Russia, and we went to their nuclear site where we had built these huge buildings to collect all the nuclear weaponry and put them in pods going down 18 feet, hundreds of them. I went to where we were helping them destroy their chemical weapons. And we funded it. I went with them where they had biological agents. By the way, the biological agents were kept in Spectre, or a town like that, and they were in a refrigerator that looked like the refrigerators we used to have in 1950 with a door handle that pulled out. And they had a string and wax on either side. In other words, they know someone got in it, but they wouldn't have stopped them. Their excuse for keeping some of these biological agents was, as the permafrost melts, they may have to deal with some, and it seemed logical, deal with some of the biological challenges that would occur from that. So don't get rid of some of the past successes in vaccines and so on. But at any rate, I had a hearing where I asked the medical community to come and talk about biological agents. And I always do this at the end of a hearing. I say, is there some question that we should have asked, you were prepared to ask, that you want to share with us? Because, you know, if they prepared for something, I thought out of courtesy, but also if we left something out, tell me about it. And so the head of the New England Medical Magazine, I think it was New England Medical, he said, I want to share with you my greatest fear. My greatest fear is that a small group of dedicated scientists can wipe out humanity as we know it. So that's in the back of my head as I'm thinking about what we experienced out of China and the biological site there, but it was probably not the biological site, it was probably the market. But that's in the back of my mind. A small group of people can cause great harm. So that's partly my bias.
I have a question here.
Sure.
Yeah, Chris, do you see realistically any change or threat to the two-party system in our lifetime the way it is right now?
One of my heroes is a man named Peter Ackerman, who made a tidy sum of money working for Mike Milken. And by the way, did not have any legal challenges against him. He went and got signatures in 40 states, and they took him to court. And in the court, he said, if I can't find someone to run in May of that year, going back a number of years ago, he said, I won't. And he couldn't get anyone to run because nobody wanted to run if they couldn't be in the debate. So he gave up. He spent about $20 million trying to do that. My view is that the best race we ever had was when Ross Perot was in the race for this reason. Ross Perot went on Larry King, and he said, he was on almost every week. This is what we raise in revenue. We have this amount that we spend. This is called the deficit. And every year the deficit is added to the debt, and it goes up and up and up. I can tell you that after that race, the Republicans and Democrats worked overtime to balance the budget. And when Republicans took over, we actually balanced it for 4 years with Bill Clinton's support. We balanced, and it was solely because we had a different voice in there. If Ross Perot was not in that debate, now, admittedly, he was kind of crazy. He said, somebody from outer space did this, and, but the point was there would never have been even that discussion. So the other thing I would do in the presidential race is I would have them count. Connecticut has 7 electoral votes, 2 Senate, 5 members of Congress, 7. I would have every congressional seat be independent. So if a presidential candidate only won 2 congressional seats, they get 2 of the 7. But it would get, instead of, why would a Republican go to California? Why would a Democrat go to some of the states? We need to. So I'm hopeful that we have a third person, not a third party, third person in the race that will spark. And then there's this other method, which is ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting. So 5 people in the race, but you don't want, in the end, you don't want this person to win, and this is your best choice. And if you vote for these, then this person's going to lose and this guy wins. But ranked choice voting, you rank them. Who are your top 5? And then the one who got the least amount of votes or the second is out. And your third choice is then registered. So in Maine, the Republican won the race with less than 50% of the vote, a congressman in that one district. But the Democrat ended up winning because they did ranked choice voting, and he was the second choice of more people. And he ended up with more than 50% of the vote.
Chris?
Yes.
When you made one of your annual visits to the Rotary Club in Stamford years ago, we asked you this question: do you think that there's ever a chance of having any real gun control reform legislation? And you said, and this is pretty much exactly the way you said it, not a chance. They don't have the guts to vote that way.
It depends what year.
Well,
so let me tell you a little history here. In 1994, we passed gun control. The Republicans were against it, Democrats were for it, but I realized that I could claim time on the House side in support of the gun control, instead of having all Republicans be able to speak against it. And Henry Hyde was my closer. It passed by 1 vote. And the agreement was if it passed, then it would be put in the overall reconciliation budget. Now, what happened was 19 powerful Democrats lost who voted for it in states like Texas. One of the things you understand when you're in Congress, if I spoke to a Republican who believes in gun control, if they're west of the Mississippi, they get nervous because they know most of their constituents perceive it differently. And a lot of people in the Midwest use guns sensibly. So they don't have any excuse for how they may not be used out where we live. So it's not all that they're stupid. It's that in their own environment, what they see is something different than what I see. So, background checks is a no-brainer. What I try to tell the gun control lobby and the environmental groups and others, people that I support, don't try for so much. Because after 10 years on environment, we were still working on the issue that we worked on 10 years ago. And I said, if you got this little bit of chunk, next year you can get this little. And why? Because then the American people understand it and they don't fear it. My mother did not support gay rights. When I was in the House, I supported gay rights for non-discrimination. And Ralph N. Ostrom, the Darien representative, and that's where my mother lived, showed me a letter my mother wrote to him, thanking him for his courage in opposing employment gay rights. And I was the chief sponsor of the bill. To her credit, though, she never spoke to me about it. The only time I ever caved into my mother was English as the official language of the United States. That's the only, and because I thought, what the heck. But isn't that funny how my own mother, and she loved his courage, but she never spoke to me about it. No, but my point, no, what's my point? I bet if she was a little long, she would have gotten used to the concept and not feared it a little bit. So if we had done a little bit over 10 years, we would have had a giant leap from what was 10 years ago. And not because we slipped it through or something, it's just that people began to understand it. We got 7 more minutes.
Okay.
This is a genius. She's gotten me in a lot of trouble as a Republican because she is the expert on census. And I went along with, and Mort, her dad, knows that I went along with her, and it got me in a lot of trouble. Was it with the Bush administration?
Yeah.
But you were right, but that's irrelevant, right?
Oh, you're kind. But first of all, we're so delighted to have you back in Stamford. And I have a very quick question.
That's the silliest things people say. A quick question can have a long answer. Right?
Yes, that's fine. That's fine. The floor is yours. First of all, I generally don't speak up in public, but I have to say I know that all my sisters in the room, meaning all the women here, have very important things to say, and no women had asked a question yet, so I'm going to do it. But I will stick to my wheelhouse. As the Congressman said, he and I worked in Congress together, me as a senior staffer, on issues related to the census. So I just wanted to ask if you would follow up quickly. You talked a little earlier, there was a question from the gentleman in the back about whether we should have more than 2 major parties, and then you talked about ranked choice voting. But what do you think of the idea that maybe the size of the US House of Representatives needs to grow? It has not grown since 1910, which wasn't codified.
You want more members of Congress?
I know, that's the joke, right? But seriously, we have had the same number, other than temporarily for Hawaii and Alaska, since 1910. And of course, the population has grown substantially. So what do you think about that in terms of people being closer to their member of Congress and having better representation?
I wonder if they would be that much closer, even if you added 100 by the time you spread it out. So I don't know if you would achieve what you were hoping. It's unfortunate that the court decided corporations and others could contribute. I mean, that's really harmful. So I guess I don't know. But if I was in Congress and I had to decide, I'd have to figure it out. I just don't know. There's 465 seats. So we could, in the chamber, 465. But I don't think I'd like it to be like in the parliament in England, where only 1/3 get to sit in and the others have to watch on TV or whatever it is. It's, well, so.
What do you think will, what's your thoughts about what will happen in the Ukraine? Will this war continue on for months on end? Will there be peace, hopefully? Will the United States and our allies still support Ukraine even down the road?
If I was a member of Congress, the first thing I would have started with is, can we have a prayer for the world? Can we have a prayer for the men and women in Ukraine? And can we salute their unbelievable bravery? So I didn't do that. I don't know how we can allow someone to threaten us with nuclear weapons and then give in, because then they can continue to do it. So, but what's scary is we in the United States know we have a safer way to prevent the misuse of nuclear weapons than Russia does. In fact, at one point, we even gave them information that would help them better prevent the misuse. I don't know what 3 people in a submarine can do if they all agree. And I don't know if it's 3 or whatever. So I'm really concerned about the whole proliferation. I was telling someone yesterday, this is the difficult thing when you're an elected official. The outrageous thing that the Crown Prince did in Turkey and authorizing, the outrageous thing. The problem is we need him to supply more oil. We need him to do certain things. And so our challenge is we could almost cut ourselves off from everyone who wasn't as perfect as we are. And then where are we at? I mean, I'm wrestling with it. I just don't know how you deal with that. So I think that I don't know enough. If I was in Congress, I would want to know why we are not giving them airplanes. I'm told that they're better able to use their old airplanes against the more modern Russian airplanes. That's what I'm told. And when you see this long track of weaponry headed into the areas that Russia intends to just absolutely obliterate, I don't know what the world's going to be like in 5 years. How do we work with Putin? I can't figure that out. How do we work with him? How do we get some sense about our nuclear weaponry and start to reduce it? How do we do those things? Some questions aren't easy to answer. Two more minutes. Yeah, I'm going to take one. And yeah, yes. I'm sorry. Hi.
Oh,
why don't you do you mind standing up?
Sure. As you were getting into government and politics, what are some things that really helped you get into that field that you would recommend to other people, or specifically young people who are also interested in doing so?
I would recommend that they do a lot of reading about past leaders in our country and what we liked about them and what we didn't like. I would recommend that you not run unless you really want to. I would recommend you got to love people and you got to be a good listener. And if you're a good listener, you're going to grow. What did I miss when I was no longer in Congress? I missed my constituents. I missed the learning. I missed my staff, that they worked for you before they worked for me. I mean, they even told me that. I would do a lot of reading and so on. And then I would find someone that you like in politics and try to interact. I would be an intern, either locally for someone or in Washington. I never hired a staff who came out of college if they hadn't been willing to be an intern. And if they were an intern, then we would contact where they had, who they had served. So, and that you get a lot of satisfaction from helping other people, and that you are willing to take the grief and hold no anger or hate. I'm going to tell you 2 quick stories because I know we're ending. One story is, I love this story. There's a story of a tribe out west, and the parents would tell their child, within you are 2 wolves. Some of you may know this. 2 wolves. One is beautiful, kind, thoughtful, gentle, smart. The other is hateful, mean, harmful. And the question is, dear loved one, which wolf are you going to feed? And this gets back to my question that I touched on with Trump. I think Trump is feeding the wrong wolf in our society. And he's bringing out a wolf that I don't like to think is part of America. Now, my last point is, and this relates to Stanford, I went door to door to door to door. And it was Christopher Shays is listening. That was before I knew my job was to listen, learn, help, teach, and lead. But I just had so much fun. And one day, this shaped my political focus. I came to a house, a young woman, kids were crawling over. I suspected that, frankly, I knew she was, because I had a book, it was before computers and iPhones and so on. And I suspected, as she was a Democrat, but I'm being honest, I thought this is going to be my typical version or my stereotype of a liberal Jewish constituent. And she fit it, she started to at least. She said, we have all these needs, you got to fill these needs and you got to do this and you got to do this. And then she said, but I can't stand programs that waste money. And I thought that was interesting. The same day, and this was off of High Ridge Road, I'm going back and there's this White House, 3 stories, probably built in the late 1800s or mid 1800s. And an older gentleman came out, and then I was like 28. And I thought, and he was Republican. I thought he was probably an Episcopalian, conservative. That was my stereotype, I admit. And he said, I'm tired of the waste in government. You got to do something about it. And he went on about waste. And then he said, these are his exact words, but young man, I don't like knowing how I live here, knowing how people down there, pointed to live. And I thought, my God, they're not all that different. They think they're different, but they're not all that different. One starts from one end, one starts from the other, and that made it so easy for me because that's where I was. When it was introduced as a socially conscious and a conservative financially. And why not? I was raised here. So with tears felt in my eyes, I want to thank all of you because you gave me an opportunity of a lifetime and you shaped me, I think, the right way so I could look back on my experience with some gratitude and pride. So thank you very much. I want you to know this was a real thrill for me. I haven't been back in Stanford in a long time, and thank you.